If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I've seen things in Yosemite that no one would believe. Even now, years later, my hands shake when I think about those dark October nights of 1967. I'm writing this down not because I want to, but because I have to. People need to know what's out there, especially when the moon is full. I was 42 then, working as a park ranger at Yosemite National Park. Most folks saw me as the quiet guy who kept to himself, the one who was really good at finding lost hikers. They didn't know about my time in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division, or the nightmares that still woke me up sweating. My wife had left 6 months earlier, couldn't handle my jumpy nerves and midnight screams anymore. Can't say I blamed her. The only thing I had left from my war days was my lucky compass. Saved my life more times than I can count, both in Nam and later. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started when 3 college kids went missing near Glacier Point. Nothing too unusual at first. We got missing hikers all the time. But this was different. Something felt wrong from the moment I read the report. Maybe it was the way their campsite looked. Sleeping bags torn to shreds, backpacks ripped apart like paper, and strange tracks in the mud, like wolf prints, but wrong somehow. They were too big, and they showed whatever made them was walking on 2 legs. The weather that October was weird too, colder than anyone could remember, with this strange silvery mist that would roll in at night. The moon looked bigger than usual, casting shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Even the animals were acting strange. Bears heading up the mountains when they should have been moving down, birds flying in circles like they were confused. That's when old Joseph, an elder from the local tribe, came to my office. I'll never forget his face when he told me about the Skinned One, an ancient evil that hunts during the full moon. I'd heard Native American legends before, but something in his eyes made my combat instincts kick in. He wasn't telling stories, he was warning me. The moon hungers, he said, his wrinkled hands gripping his walking stick. It has awakened again, Ranger Thorne. Your guns won't help you. Your modern ways won't save you. It feeds on fear before it feeds on flesh. I should have listened more carefully to old Joseph that day. Maybe if I had, more of my fellow rangers would still be alive. But how could I have known? How could anyone have known what was waiting for us up there in the darkness of Glacier Point? Looking back now, that was just the beginning of the longest, most terrifying week of my life. And believe me, after what I saw in Vietnam, I didn't think anything could scare me anymore. I was wrong, so very wrong. The next morning, I headed up to Glacier Point with my team, 4 of our best rangers. Dave, who could track anything that moved, Sarah, our medical expert, Mike, who knew these mountains better than his own backyard, and Tom, our radio guy. The morning was unusually quiet, no bird sounds, no squirrels, nothing. The first thing we found was the students' campsite. It looked like something had exploded there. Their tents were in pieces and their stuff was thrown everywhere. But what really got to me were the claw marks, not just on the trees but on the rocks too. Whatever did this was strong, really strong. "Marcus, you need to see this," Dave called out, kneeling near some bushes. He was looking at footprints in the mud, and my stomach turned when I saw them. They were like wolf tracks, but huge, bigger than my hand, and they showed whatever made them was walking on 2 legs. Sarah found their cameras nearby, smashed up, but the film was still good. When we developed the photos later, what we saw made no sense. There were these weird light streaks in every nighttime picture, and in one of them something tall and pale stood in the background. We all saw it, but nobody wanted to talk about how it seemed to glow in the moonlight. That evening things got worse. We set up camp, and I ordered everyone to stay close. The sun went down fast, and that's when we heard it, a howl that made my combat instincts scream danger. It sounded almost human, but wrong, like someone trying to copy a person's voice but not getting it quite right. "That's no coyote," Mike whispered, his hands shaking as he gripped his rifle. Then we found the deer. It was hung up in a tree, at least 15 feet high. No bear could have done that, the way it was, arranged. Reminded me of how the Viet Cong used to set traps. This wasn't random animal violence. This was planned. As night fell completely, our flashlights started acting up. They'd work fine 1 minute, then dim the next. The radio was even worse. All we got was static and this weird humming sound. Tom kept trying to call base camp, but nothing got through. "We should go back," Sarah said, and I could hear the fear in her voice. Something's not right here. But we couldn't leave, not with those students still missing. What I didn't tell my team was that I'd seen something watching us from the trees. Just for a second, when I was checking the perimeter. Something tall, something that shouldn't exist. And when it moved, well, let's just say my lucky compass went crazy, spinning in circles like it was trying to warn me. That first night, none of us slept. We sat in a tight circle around the fire, jumping at every sound. But what really got to us was the silence between those sounds, like the whole mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Little did we know that something was already hunting us, and we weren't the hunters anymore, we were the prey. The next morning, Tom was missing. We found his sleeping bag empty with long scratches in the ground nearby. His radio lay broken, still making that weird humming sound. The worst part, there was no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was like something just picked him up and walked away with him. Sarah started crying quietly. Mike kept looking over his shoulder. Dave tried to track whatever took Tom, but the tracks just stopped, like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. "We need to find those caves," I said, remembering what old Joseph told me about the creature's lair. If it took Tom and those students anywhere, it would be there. As we hiked higher up Glacier Point, we found more strange things. Old backpacks from the 1940s, torn and moldy. Tree trunks with weird symbols carved into them, symbols that looked fresh even though the trees were ancient. And everywhere that feeling of being watched. Around noon, we heard someone calling for help. Tom, is that you?" Mike shouted. "Help me, please help." The voice sounded like Tom, but something was off. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. That's when Dave grabbed my arm. "Marcus," he whispered. Tom had a stutter. This voice, it's too perfect. My blood ran cold. Whatever was calling us wasn't Tom. We found the cave entrance just before sunset. The setting sun made the rocks look blood red, and that strange mist was rolling in again. Near the entrance, we found more deer carcasses hung up like decorations, but these were fresh. "Look," Sarah pointed at the cave wall. There were paintings there, old ones. They showed a tall, skinny creature that seemed to glow. Around it were smaller figures, people, running away. And above it all was a full moon. That's when we heard it, a sound I'll never forget. Like someone dragging metal across stone, getting closer and closer. We all turned our flashlights toward the cave's darkness. And there it was. 9 feet tall if it was an inch, skin so pale it was almost see-through, like you could see the moonlight through it. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, but its face, God, its face. It had no eyes, just dark holes that seemed to pull you in. Mike screamed and fired his rifle. The creature moved faster than anything that big should move. Our flashlights went dead all at once. In the darkness, I heard Sarah yell. Then Mike's rifle hit the ground. I grabbed my lucky compass. It was spinning wildly now. Through its glass, I saw something that saved my life. The creature's skin seemed to fade when it passed through the shadows. It was strongest in the moonlight, weakest in the dark. "The caves!" I yelled. "Everyone into the caves, now!" But as we ran into the darkness, I realized we were doing exactly what it wanted. We weren't escaping. We were walking right into its home. Inside the cave, everything changed. The air felt thick and cold, and our footsteps echoed in ways that didn't make sense. Mike was shaking so bad he could barely hold his flashlight. Sarah kept close to me, her medical bag clutched tight to her chest. Dave was in front, trying to find a way deeper in. Then we found them, the missing students, or what was left of them. They were huddled in a corner, not moving, their faces. They looked like they'd died from pure fear. Next to them were other bodies, some fresh, some just bones. Decades of victims all arranged in a horrible circle. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. "Look at the walls." The cave walls were covered in claw marks, but they weren't random. They made patterns, like the creature was trying to write something. Between the marks were more of those tribal symbols, glowing faintly with a sickly blue light. That's when we heard Tom's voice again, but this time it was different. Marcus. The stutter was back. It's still alive." We found him hanging from the cave ceiling, barely breathing. His eyes were wide with terror. It wants us to be afraid," he gasped. "It feeds on our fear first, makes us taste better." Before we could get him down, the creature appeared at the end of the tunnel. But this time it did something new. It spoke. The voice was like rocks grinding together. "So much fear," it said. "So sweet." Mike lost it. He turned and ran deeper into the caves. The creature's head snapped toward him, and in a blur, it was gone. Mike's screams echoed through the tunnels, getting fainter and fainter until they just stopped. Dave pulled out an old piece of paper, something old Joseph had given him. The symbols, he said, his voice shaking. They're a trap spell, if we can complete the circle. He never finished that sentence. The creature grabbed him from behind, its long arms reaching out of the darkness. Sarah screamed. I fired my gun, but the bullets went right through it like it was made of mist. I ran after them, following Dave's screams. Sarah was right behind me. We ended up in a huge cave chamber, moonlight streaming in from a hole in the ceiling. The creature had Dave pinned against the wall. Its skin was glowing brighter now, pulsing with the moonlight. Then I noticed something. My compass wasn't spinning anymore. It was pointing straight at a small, dark tunnel. Through it I could see stars. The moon was setting. Sarah, I whispered, we need to keep it busy until the moon sets. It's our only chance. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at something behind me, her face white with terror. I turned slowly, and there it was, its face inches from mine, those black holes where its eyes should be staring right into my soul. Your fear, it hissed. It will last me years. What happened next is still hard for me to talk about. The creature lunged at me, but something strange happened. My lucky compass started glowing. The creature jerked back like it had been hurt. That's when I remembered what old Joseph had said. Some things from war carry power. They've seen too much death to be normal anymore. Sarah was smart. While the creature was distracted, she grabbed Dave and pulled him toward the dark tunnel. I kept backing up, holding my compass out like a shield. Each step felt like moving through mud. My body wanted to freeze in fear, but my military training kept me moving. Your trinket won't save you, the creature snarled. Its voice was changing, becoming more human-like. Then it did something worse. It started speaking in the voices of all its victims. I heard the college students, the missing hikers, even Mike and Tom, all begging for help. The moonlight in the cave was getting weaker. The creature knew it too. It became more desperate, moving faster, its long arms reaching for us. Sarah screamed. One of its claws had caught her leg. I grabbed her and pulled, leaving my compass behind. We ran through the dark tunnel, Dave limping between us. Behind us, the creature's angry roar shook the whole cave. Rocks started falling from the ceiling. The whole place was coming down. There, Sarah pointed. We could see the cave exit just a few yards away. The sky outside was turning grey. Dawn was coming. But we weren't going to make it. The creature appeared in front of us, blocking the exit. Its skin was barely glowing now, but it looked angrier than ever. In the fading moonlight, I could see through its skin, see the bones and spirits of all the people it had taken. If I die, it growled, you die with me. The cave ceiling cracked. Huge rocks started falling. The creature reached for us with both arms, its mouth opening wider than any mouth should. But then something incredible happened. The sun peeked over the mountain. The first ray of sunlight hit the creature. It screamed, not in pain but in surprise. Its skin started to fade, becoming see-through. I saw my chance. I pushed Sarah and Dave toward the exit and charged straight at the creature. We both fell, tumbling toward the edge of a cliff inside the cave. The creature's claws dug into my arm. The pain was worse than any wound I'd got in Vietnam, but I held on. If I was going down, this thing was coming with me. The last thing I remember before we fell was seeing my compass on the ground, still glowing, pointing straight at the rising sun. I woke up 3 days later in the park's medical center. My right arm was wrapped in bandages. The doctors said the wounds were unlike anything they'd ever seen. Sarah and Dave made it out alive, but they were different after that night. We all were. The official report said it was a bear attack. The missing students, hiking accident. Tom and Mike, never found. That's what the park service told everyone, but we knew the truth. They found my compass near the cave entrance, bent and broken, but still somehow pointing north. The cave itself had collapsed. Tons of rock sealed the entrance. They never found the creature's body. Never found most of its victims either. Old Joseph came to visit me in the hospital. He nodded when I told him what happened, like he wasn't surprised at all. The skinned one sleeps now, he said, but it will wake again. The moon commands it. He was right. I still work at Yosemite, but in a different sector now. Every full moon I see the signs. Strange tracks in the snow. Hikers reporting weird noises. Lights where there shouldn't be any. And sometimes on really quiet nights I hear that howl, that almost human howl. The Park Service closes Glacier Point during full moons now. They say it's for maintenance, but I know better. Sarah quit her job and moved away. Dave still works here, but he never goes out after dark. As for me, I got a new compass, but it's not the same. Nothing's been the same since that night. You might be wondering why I'm telling this story now after all these years. Well, yesterday I saw something that made my blood run cold. fresh claw marks on a tree near my cabin, and they were arranged in those same symbols we saw in the cave. The marks were still wet, like they'd just been made. And tonight is a full moon. My name is Daniel McCarthy, but most folks around here just call me Wolf. I guess that nickname's more fitting now than ever before, considering everything that happened in Superior National Forest back in '83. I've been a ranger here for 15 years, and the stories I'm about to tell you, well, let's just say they changed my life forever. I grew up in these parts, raised by my Ojibwe grandfather after my parents passed. He was a wise old man who taught me everything about tracking, the old ways, and the spirits of the forest. Back then, I thought they were just stories to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods at night. How wrong I was. I'm 38 now, and I've seen things in these woods that most people wouldn't believe. Before all this happened, I was known as one of the best trackers in the search and rescue team. Lost hikers, missing campers, I could find them all. My grandfather always said I had a special connection to the forest, just like our ancestors. But 2 years ago, I lost my partner Mike to something I couldn't explain. Found his gear torn to pieces, but his body, well, that's what started this whole thing. It was mid-January 1983, and Minnesota was going through the worst cold snap I'd ever seen. The thermometer outside my cabin was showing negative 50 DU4F, and the old trees in the forest were cracking from the freeze. Something felt different about the woods that winter. The animals were acting strange, and we started getting reports about weird wolf behavior. Not just regular weird, I mean impossible weird. You see, these forests are old. Some of these trees were here before Columbus sailed the ocean. They've seen things, held secrets. My grandfather used to say that when the land holds dark memories, they sometimes wake up. I didn't understand what he meant until that winter. I remember sitting in my cabin that first night when it all began, listening to the wind howling through the trees. Except it wasn't just the wind. There was something else in that howl, something that made my skin crawl. It sounded almost like words. That's when my radio crackled to life. Wolf, you there? We've got another missing person report. That's the third one this week. Little did I know this was just the beginning of what would become the longest and darkest 2 weeks of my life. A story that would test everything I thought I knew about reality, about nature, and about myself. Want to know what happened next? Well, grab a seat. This is going to take a while, and trust me, you won't believe half of it. But every word I'm about to tell you is true. I've got the scars to prove it. It started with the first body we found. I still remember that morning. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. I got a call about some strange tracks near Cedar Lake, and what I found there still gives me nightmares. The tracks were wolf prints, but something was wrong about them. They started as normal wolf tracks, then slowly changed. By the end, they looked almost human. Next to them was Tom Richards, one of our local hunters, or what was left of him. His body was different. His hands were twisted, halfway between human fingers and wolf claws. His face. I'd never seen anything like it. Over the next few days, 6 more people vanished. Each time we found them, it was the same story. Bodies partially changed, like they were turning into something else. The weird part, regular wolves were running away from the forest. I'd never seen that before. Animals know things we don't, and they were telling us to get out. One night, while I was checking the radio reports, I heard it. A howl, but not like any wolf I'd ever heard. It spoke words. Actual words. Join us, it said. I thought I was going crazy, but then other rangers reported the same thing. The local farmers were losing their minds. Their cattle were being killed, but not in any way a normal wolf would hunt. We found cows with perfectly circular wounds, others with strange symbols carved into them. This wasn't normal predator behavior. I started finding things in the forest. Small bone totems hanging from trees, arranged in patterns my grandfather used to draw. The same patterns he warned me about as a kid. At night we'd see eyes in the darkness, green eyes, dozens of them, more than any normal wolf pack should have. That's when I knew I had to go back to my grandfather's teachings. He'd left me his old medicine bag full of sacred herbs and silver items. Keep these, he'd said. One day you'll understand why. Now I did. But the worst part, the thing that really got to me, one of the victims was still alive when we found them. Jenny Martinez, a college student who'd been hiking. She was changing, right in front of us. Her screams, half human, half wolf, I'll never forget them. We tried to help her, but by the time we got her to the hospital, she'd disappeared. just vanished, leaving claw marks on the walls. That's when I realized this wasn't just about finding missing people anymore. Something ancient had woken up in my forest, something that had been waiting for a long time, and somehow I knew it was connected to those old stories my grandfather used to tell me by the fire. You know what's really scary? This was just the beginning. Things were about to get much, much worse. The real horror hadn't even started yet. Should I continue? Because what happened next? Well, that's when things got really strange. Let me tell you about the night everything changed. I was at the ranger station with my team, Mike Barnes, Sarah Chen, and Chris Thompson. We were looking at maps, trying to make sense of where all these attacks were happening. That's when Chris noticed something weird. All the attacks formed a pattern, like a huge spiral on the map. And right in the center, an old Ojibwe burial ground my grandfather used to tell me about. Guys, Sarah said, looking out the window, something's wrong. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing, just dead silence. Then we saw them, dozens of green eyes in the darkness surrounding the station. The wolves came out of the shadows, but these weren't normal wolves. They walked on their hind legs, some of them nearly 7 feet tall, and their faces. They were caught between wolf and human, with long snouts full of sharp teeth, but eyes that looked almost human. "Get the silver," I yelled, remembering my grandfather's warnings. We had some silver bullets I'd made just in case, but before we could reach them, Chris started acting strange. "It's so cold," he whispered, even though we were inside. His eyes turned green just like the ones outside. Sarah screamed as Chris's hands began to change, his fingers stretching into claws. "Run!" I shouted to Mike and Sarah. We barely made it to the back room when Chris, or what used to be Chris, broke down the door. His voice was different now, a horrible mix of human words and wolf growls. "Join the pack," he said. "The alpha calls." I grabbed my grandfather's medicine bag and threw some sacred herbs at him. Chris howled in pain and backed away, giving us just enough time to escape through the back window. We ran into the forest, but something was wrong. The trails we'd known for years had changed. Trees seemed to move in the darkness. Every path led us back to the burial ground. "Wolf," Mike panted as we ran, "your grandfather. What did he say about this?" I remembered his words. Every 40 years when the moon bleeds red, the alpha returns. It hungers for souls to add to its pack. That's when we heard it, a howl so powerful it shook the trees. But this wasn't just any howl, it was calling my name. "Daniel McCarthy," it echoed through the forest. "Your grandfather denied me. You cannot." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Wolf, look." In the distance where the burial ground was, green light pulsed like a heartbeat. And standing there, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen, was a shape that haunted my grandfather's stories. The alpha had revealed itself, and it was coming for us. Want to know what happened when we faced it? Because that's when I learned the real truth about my family's connection to these woods and why the alpha wanted me so badly. We ran until our lungs burned, but there was nowhere safe to go. Mike, Sarah, and I ended up hiding in an old park ranger cabin I knew about. While catching our breath, I pulled out my grandfather's old journal from my backpack. I knew the answers we needed were in there. "Look at this," I said, my hands shaking as I turned the pages. In 1943, the same thing happened. And before that, 1903, every 40 years, just like grandfather said. Sarah was keeping watch at the window. "Wolf, these markings in the journal, they're the same ones we found in the forest." That's when Mike made a shocking discovery on his phone. "Guys, I found something about a massacre in 1873. A whole village disappeared near here. The only survivor was my great-grandfather." I finished his sentence. "Grandfather told me that story. He said our family was chosen to protect these woods." Suddenly, Sarah grabbed my arm. "They're here." Through the window, we saw them. The pack was moving differently now, organized, hunting together. Leading them was Chris, his transformed face still recognizable. But behind the pack was something worse, something huge. The alpha stepped into the moonlight. It was twice the size of a normal wolf, with pitch-black fur and those same glowing green eyes. But what scared me most was its intelligence. It wasn't just a monster, it was smart, ancient, and it had a plan. "Your grandfather took something from me, Daniel," the alpha's voice echoed in my head. "The power that should have been mine. Now you will take his place in my pack." I opened my grandfather's medicine bag with trembling hands. Inside was a silver necklace with strange symbols and a letter I'd never seen before. "Daniel," the letter began in my grandfather's handwriting. If you're reading this, the Alpha has returned. Our family's blood carries an ancient power. The Alpha needs it to stay in our world. Don't let it win. The ceremony must be performed at the burial ground during the lunar eclipse. Only then can it be sent back. I checked my phone's calendar. The lunar eclipse was tomorrow night. We have to end this, I told Mike and Sarah, but I need your help. Mike loaded his gun with silver bullets. Sarah grabbed the sacred herbs, but before we could make a plan, we heard Chris's voice outside. "You can't hide forever, Wolf," he called. "The change is coming for all of you." The cabin walls started to creak. The pack was closing in. We had one night to prepare for the biggest fight of our lives, and I had no idea if we'd survive it. The next few hours were the longest of my life. We barricaded ourselves in the cabin, using everything my grandfather had taught me. I drew protective symbols with sacred herbs around the windows and doors while Sarah and Mike prepared the weapons. "The eclipse starts at 11:47 tomorrow night," Sarah said, checking her phone. "We have less than 24 hours. That's when we heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Jenny Martinez's voice, the college student who disappeared from the hospital. "Please help me," she cried from outside. "I'm so cold." Mike moved toward the door, but I stopped him. "It's not her anymore," I whispered. "It's a trap." The voice changed, becoming a horrible mix of human and wolf. More voices joined in, people who'd gone missing calling out to us. The pack was playing with our minds. Around dawn, everything went quiet. Too quiet. We looked outside and saw why. The pack had disappeared, but they'd left us a message. Dead animals arranged in a circle, pointing toward the burial ground. "They're waiting for us there," I said, studying my grandfather's journal. "The Alpha needs to complete the ceremony during the eclipse. It needs my blood to stay in this world." "So what's the plan?" Mike asked, checking his silver bullets. I showed them the ceremony my grandfather had written down. "We have to turn their ritual against them. But," I hesitated, "there's a catch. Whoever performs it might not come back the same." Sarah squeezed my hand. "We're with you, Wolf, all the way." We spent the day preparing. I taught them the ancient words my grandfather had written down. We made more silver bullets and packed the sacred herbs, but we all knew the real battle would be about more than weapons. As the sun started to set, we heard it, the Alpha's howl, calling its pack together. The sound was different now, more powerful. It made the trees shake and the ground rumble. "It's time," I said, putting on my grandfather's silver necklace. "Remember, no matter what happens to me, you have to complete the ceremony." We stepped out of the cabin into the darkening forest. The full moon was rising and soon the eclipse would begin. The air felt heavy with magic and danger. Mike checked his watch. 2 hours until the eclipse. We started walking toward the burial ground, following the trail of green eyes watching us from the darkness. With each step, I could feel something changing inside me. The Alpha's power was growing stronger, and somehow I could feel it trying to pull me in. "Wolf," Sarah whispered, "your eyes." I caught my reflection in a puddle. My eyes had started to glow green. The change was beginning, and we weren't even at the burial ground yet. As we got closer to the burial ground, the forest seemed to come alive. The trees swayed without wind, and strange whispers echoed around us. My body felt weird, like I was burning up from the inside. "Look," Sarah pointed at the sky. The moon was starting to turn red. The eclipse was beginning. That's when we saw them. The entire pack was waiting at the burial ground, standing in a circle. Chris was there, and Jenny, and all the others who'd been turned. In the center stood the Alpha, bigger and more terrifying than ever. Finally, the Alpha's voice boomed in our heads. "The last of the McCarthy line comes to join us." My hands were changing now, fingers stretching into claws. It hurt so much I could barely hold my grandfather's medicine bag. "Fight it, Wolf!" Mike shouted, raising his gun. The Alpha laughed, a horrible sound that was half howl, half human. "Shoot if you must, but your friend is already becoming one of us." The pack attacked. Mike fired his silver bullets, and Sarah threw the sacred herbs. Some of the werewolves fell back, howling in pain, but there were too many. "The ceremony," I yelled, fighting the change taking over my body. "Start it now." Sarah began reading from my grandfather's journal while Mike protected her. I forced myself to walk toward the Alpha, even though every step felt like walking through fire. "You're just like your grandfather," the Alpha snarled. He thought he could stop me too, but this time I'll have what I want. The moon turned completely red above us. My transformation was getting worse, fur sprouting on my arms, teeth sharpening into fangs. But something else was happening too. I could feel the forest's power, just like my grandfather said I would. "You don't understand," I growled through changed lips. My grandfather didn't stop you because he was strong. He stopped you because the forest chose him, just like it chose me. I pulled out my grandfather's silver necklace. The symbols on it began to glow. The trees around us groaned, their branches reaching down like hands. The Alpha's eyes widened. For the first time I saw fear in them. No, it howled. The forest is mine. Sarah's voice grew louder, reading the final words of the ceremony. Mike fired his last silver bullets at the pack. And I made the hardest choice of my life. The forest doesn't belong to anyone, I said. We belong to it. I grabbed the silver necklace with my now clawed hands and slammed it into the ground. The earth cracked open, glowing with the same green light as the Alpha's eyes. Now, Sarah, I screamed, my voice a mix of human and wolf. She shouted the final words of the ceremony, her voice echoing through the forest. The Alpha lunged at me, but something amazing happened. The ancient trees of the forest, the ones that had been here for hundreds of years, their branches swept down like giant arms holding the Alpha back. This ends tonight, I growled. The moon above us turned blood red, and I felt power surge through my body. Not the Alpha's dark power, but something older, something that belonged to the forest itself. Mike fired his last silver bullet, hitting the Alpha's chest. It howled in pain, but kept coming. The pack moved in too, but the trees held them back. Then everything seemed to happen at once. The ground under the burial ground burst open, green light shooting up into the red moon. The Alpha's body started breaking apart like shadow turning to smoke. All around us, the transformed people, Chris, Jenny, all of them began changing back to human. But the Alpha wasn't done. With its last bit of strength, it sank its teeth into my shoulder. Pain shot through my body like fire. If I go, it snarled, part of me stays with you forever. The forest erupted with light. Sarah finished the ceremony, her last words mixing with my scream. The Alpha dissolved into the air like black smoke, pulled into the crack in the earth. The red moon above turned back to silver. When it was over, the forest was quiet again. The pack members were all human, confused but alive. Mike and Sarah ran to help them. But I was different. The Alpha's bite had changed me. I could feel it in my blood. I wasn't fully human anymore, but I wasn't like the Alpha either. The forest had chosen me, just like it chose my grandfather. Wolf, Sarah approached carefully. Are you? You. I looked at my hands. They could still change into claws, but I could control it now. I'm me, I said. Just a different me. Mike helped Chris stand up. What happens now? I looked around at the ancient forest that had helped us win. Now we protect it, like my family always has. But this time we do it together. That was 2 years ago. I still change during the full moon, but it's not like before. The forest's power helps me control it. We rebuilt the ranger station, and now we teach others about the old ways, about respecting the forest. Sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear wolves howling in the distance, but they're normal wolves now, part of the forest's natural balance. The Alpha is gone, but its story lives on as a reminder that some places have ancient powers, and they choose their guardians carefully. I'm one of those guardians now. Different, yes. Changed, yes. But still protecting these woods, just like my grandfather did. And you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way. My name is Vincent O'Malley, and I've spent most of my life exploring caves in the Ozark Mountains. At 47, I thought I'd seen everything these dark hollows could throw at me. I was wrong. Dead wrong. I should have known better, especially after losing my younger brother Tommy in these same caves back in '69. That loss has haunted me every single day. Maybe that's why I never quit, became a cave rescue specialist, used my Marine Force recon training to help others. Some folks call me crazy for going back into the caves after what happened to Tommy, but they don't understand. These mountains are in my blood. It all started in late September 1971. We'd been having the worst drought anyone could remember. The dried up streams and rivers revealed cave openings nobody had ever seen before. At first it was exciting. We found some ancient cave paintings, strange symbols carved into rocks. Local folks started talking about old stories their grandparents used to tell, about creatures living deep inside the mountains. I didn't pay much attention to those tales until the weird stuff began happening. First, it was just unusual sounds coming from deep underground. Not normal cave noises, mind you. These were different, like something between a screech and a whisper. Then the ground started shaking in ways that didn't make sense to anyone who knew anything about earthquakes. But what really got my attention was when 3 young cave explorers went missing. They were good kids, experienced ones too. They knew what they were doing. When their families came to me for help, I couldn't say no. Maybe I saw a chance to make up for not saving Tommy. Maybe I was just doing my job. Either way, I had no idea I was about to uncover something that would change everything I thought I knew about these mountains. I remember sitting in my cabin that night, cleaning my old rescue gear, not knowing I was about to face something that no amount of military training or cave experience could have prepared me for. Something that had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time. The next morning, I gathered my team at the cave entrance. There were 5 of us. Me, Sarah, our medical expert, Mike, another ex-military guy, Dave, who knew these caves better than his own backyard, and Lisa, our radio specialist. The morning was unusually cold and a strange mist hung around the cave mouth like a warning. "Something's different about this cave," Dave said, shining his flashlight into the darkness. He was right. The entrance looked normal enough, but there was a weird smell coming from inside, like wet metal and something rotting. We found the first strange thing right away, footprints in the mud. But they weren't from our missing kids. These were wrong. They looked human, but not quite right. Too long, with marks that looked like extra toes. Sarah took pictures while I tried to radio back to base. That's when we noticed the first bad sign. Our radios were already getting static, even though we were still at the entrance. "Vincent, look at this," Mike called out, his voice echoing off the walls. He was holding something that made my stomach turn, a backpack, torn to shreds, belonging to one of the missing kids. But the way it was torn, I'd seen bear attacks before, and this wasn't that. The cuts were too clean, too precise. As we moved deeper into the cave, the air got heavier. Our lights showed us things that didn't make sense. There were claw marks on the walls, way too high up for any normal animal. We found tools scattered around, not just from our missing kids, but old rusty ones too, maybe from the 1930s. Then we saw the markings, ancient cave paintings, but these weren't like the usual ones showing hunters or animals. These showed something else, tall, twisted figures with too many limbs, living deep in the mountain. Lisa, who knew about local Native American history, went pale when she saw them. "The old stories," she whispered. "They weren't just stories." That's when we heard it, a sound that made us all freeze. From deep in the cave came a noise that wasn't quite a screech and wasn't quite a whisper. It was followed by what sounded like rocks moving, but not falling, more like someone was moving them on purpose. We all looked at each other, our flashlight beams shaking slightly. We were only an hour into the cave, and already every instinct I had from my Marine days was screaming at me to turn back. But those 3 kids were still missing, and I couldn't bear the thought of another person being lost in these caves, not after Tommy. "We keep going," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "But stay close. Something's very wrong down here." If only I knew then just how right I was. Things went bad real fast after that. About 2 hours into the cave, our lights started acting strange, flickering when they shouldn't. We were following a narrow tunnel that kept going deeper and deeper underground when Dave noticed something odd about the walls. "These aren't natural," he said, running his hand over the stone. "Look at these marks. It's like something dug this tunnel." Before anyone could respond, our main light died. In the dim glow of our backup lights, we heard something moving in the darkness ahead. It sounded like feet dragging on rock, but also like claws scratching the walls. Then we heard something that made my blood run cold. Someone calling for help, but the voice kept changing, like it was trying to copy different people's voices. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please help." It sounded just like one of the missing kids, then suddenly shifted to sound like an old man, then a woman. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Vincent, that's not possible. How can..." That's when the rocks started moving. Not falling, moving, like the cave itself was alive. A large boulder rolled across our path, nearly crushing Mike. We could hear grinding sounds all around us, and the tunnel behind us started closing in. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted forward, our lights bouncing wildly off the walls. Lisa tripped and I pulled her up just as a section of the floor disappeared, revealing a deep pit below. The cave was changing, trying to trap us. We found ourselves in a large chamber, gasping for breath. That's when our lights showed us something that made us all stop breathing for a moment. Bones. Hundreds of bones. Some looked ancient, others terrifyingly fresh. Among them were modern items, cameras, backpacks, even old military equipment. "Look," Mike whispered, pointing to a corner. There was a government ID card from the 1950s, and next to it, papers marked top secret that had almost rotted away. Then we heard it, a sound like rocks shifting behind us. We turned around slowly, our lights revealing something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with skin like wet stone. It had too many arms, each ending in long, sharp claws, but its face was the worst part. It had no eyes, just dark holes, and a mouth full of teeth that looked like stalactites. The creature made that horrible screeching whisper sound again, and this time we could see dozens of smaller shapes moving in the darkness behind it. "Oh God," Lisa whimpered. "We're not alone down here. We were never alone down here." That's when our lights went out completely, and the real horror began. In the pitch darkness, I fumbled for my emergency flares. The red glow lit up the chamber, showing us something horrible. These creatures were everywhere, crawling on the walls and ceiling. They moved like spiders, but they were huge, human-sized. "The tunnel to the left," I shouted. "Move, move, move." We ran, but Dave wasn't fast enough. I heard his scream fade into the darkness behind us. Sarah tried to go back for him, but I grabbed her arm. "We can't help him now," I said, my heart breaking at my own words. The tunnel got narrower and narrower. We could hear them coming after us, their claws scraping against rock. Mike was using his military training, throwing flares behind us to slow them down. But then Lisa started acting strange. "Do you hear that?" she said, her voice sounding distant. It's so beautiful." Before we could stop her, she turned and walked toward the darkness, like she was in a trance. The creatures were somehow getting in our heads, calling to us. Sarah grabbed Lisa's jacket, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed her. We found ourselves in another chamber, this one different from the others. In the center was a pool of black water, and carved into the walls were symbols that seemed to glow faintly. That's when I saw something that made my legs go weak, Tommy's old watch, the one he was wearing when he disappeared 2 years ago. "Vincent," Mike whispered urgently, "look at the water." The black water was moving, bubbling, something was coming up, but what emerged wasn't one of the creatures, it was Tommy, my brother. He looked exactly like he did the day he disappeared. "Hey, big brother," he said, smiling, "I've been waiting for you." But I knew it wasn't really Tommy. The real Tommy would never smile like that, cold and wrong, like a mask, trying to copy a human face. Sarah saw it too. "Vincent, that's not your brother," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to." Suddenly, the chamber began to shake. The fake Tommy's face changed, twisting into something inhuman. The black water started rising fast, and more creatures emerged from it. We were trapped, with water rising on one side and monsters on the other. I looked at the few flares we had left and the explosives in my pack. I knew what I had to do, but it would either save us or kill us all. I grabbed the explosives from my pack with shaking hands. Years of Marine training kicked in as I quickly set them up around the chamber's main support columns. The creatures were getting closer, and that thing wearing Tommy's face was still smiling that horrible smile. "Sarah, Mike, get to higher ground," I shouted over the sound of rushing water. The black water was now up to our waists, ice cold and thick like oil. "What about you?" Sarah screamed back. "I'll be right behind you," I lied. Someone had to set off the charges at just the right moment, and I knew it had to be me. Maybe this was my chance to finally make things right, to end whatever evil lived in these caves. The fake Tommy spoke again, but now its voice was changing, becoming deeper, inhuman. "Brother, stay with us. Stay in the dark where you belong." More creatures were emerging from the water, their stone-like skin glistening in our last flare's light. The water was now up to our chests. Mike helped Sarah climb onto a high ledge, then reached back for me. That's when I saw it. Behind all the creatures, in a dark corner, there was a nest. Not just any nest, but one filled with eggs the size of basketballs. This wasn't just about saving ourselves anymore. These things were breeding, preparing for something bigger. "Vincent, grab my hand," Mike yelled. I looked at the detonator in my hand, then at my friends. "Get out through the upper tunnel. You've got 5 minutes." "No," Sarah screamed. "We're not leaving you." But Mike understood. He was a soldier too. I saw him nod slowly, then grab Sarah and pull her toward the tunnel. I waited until they were almost out of sight. The water was at my neck now. The creatures were closing in, and that thing wearing my brother's face was just feet away. I held up the detonator where they all could see it. "This is for Tommy," I said. "The real Tommy." I pressed the button. The explosion was deafening. The cave walls cracked like thunder. Rocks started falling everywhere. The creatures screeched, a sound I'll never forget. The black water began draining through new cracks in the floor, pulling creatures down with it. I started swimming, fighting against the current that was trying to pull me down too. The last thing I remember was seeing that fake Tommy's face melt away, revealing what was really underneath, before a falling rock hit my head and everything went black. I don't remember much after the explosion. When I woke up, I was lying in a small tunnel, my clothes soaked and covered in mud. My head was throbbing and Sarah was wrapping a bandage around it. Somehow, Mike had found me in the chaos and pulled me to safety. "You crazy fool," Sarah said, but she was crying and smiling at the same time. "We thought we'd lost you." The cave was still groaning and shifting around us. Parts of it were still collapsing deep below. Mike helped me to my feet and we all started the long climb back to the surface. My legs felt like jelly and every step was painful, but we kept moving. "Did we get them all?" I asked weakly. Mike shook his head. "Some of them survived. We heard them moving deeper into the mountain. They're still down there somewhere." It took us 6 hours to find our way out. When we finally saw daylight, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. There were rescue teams waiting for us at the entrance. They'd heard the explosion from miles away. The government people showed up next day, men in dark suits who asked lots of questions and wrote everything down. They made us sign papers saying we wouldn't talk about what happened. They said they were sealing off the cave system, calling it geologically unstable. But I know the truth. Sometimes at night I still hear those sounds, that horrible screech whisper. Sometimes I catch myself looking at the mountains, knowing those things are still down there, waiting in the dark. Dave and Lisa's bodies were never found. I think about them every day, just like I think about Tommy. The official story says they got lost and died in a cave-in, but we know what really happened. I don't go cave exploring anymore. I can't, but I keep watch over these mountains. Every time I hear about strange sounds or missing people, my heart stops for a moment, because I know what's down there, in the hollow mountains, waiting. Some nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear them calling. They're getting stronger, breeding in the deep darkness, and someday I fear they might find their way up to our world. But until then, I'll be here, watching and waiting, because somebody needs to know the truth. Somebody needs to be ready. My name is Catherine Reynolds, but everyone calls me Kit. I'm a forest ranger at Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota, and what I'm about to tell you happened in October 1979, a month I'll never forget. Like my father and grandmother before me, I've spent my whole life in these woods. After serving as an army medic, I came back home to follow in their footsteps. The forest has always been my safe place, where I felt most at home. At least that's how it used to be. It all started when I was doing my regular morning patrol. The air was crisp, and the red pines were showing their first hints of fall color, but something felt off. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? That's what I felt that morning. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just silence. I stopped at Loggers Point to check on Mike's crew. They'd been cutting trees in that area all week. But when I got there, I found something that made my blood run cold. 7 sets of equipment, chainsaws, helmets, lunchboxes, all scattered around like they'd been dropped in a hurry. But no people, not a single soul. What made it worse were the trees. Some of them were twisted in ways I'd never seen before, almost like they were shaped like people. And there was this red sap oozing from their bark. In my 15 years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. I radioed back to base. "This is Ranger Reynolds. We've got a situation at Loggers Point. 7 men missing, requesting immediate backup." Little did I know this was just the beginning. What happened over the next few weeks would change everything I thought I knew about these woods and about what's really out there in the dark. As I waited for backup, I did what any ranger would do. I started looking for clues. That's when things got even stranger. I found footprints in the mud, normal boot prints at first, but they led straight into the trunk of a massive pine tree. Not around it, but right into it, like the person had walked through the solid wood. The wind picked up and I heard something that made my skin crawl: children laughing. In this part of the forest, miles from any town or campground, there shouldn't be any kids around. I pulled out my grandmother's medicine pouch, something I always carry for good luck. She was part Ojibwe, and she always said these woods held secrets. When the search team arrived, we split into groups. Officer Jim Thompson, who I'd known since high school, took 3 men north. I led my group south, following a trail of that weird red sap. As the sun started to set, a strange mist rolled in. It wasn't like normal fog, it was reddish and seemed to move against the wind. "Everyone stay close," I called out to my team. That's when our radio started acting up. Through the static we could hear voices that sounded exactly like Mike and his missing crew. They were calling for help, but the sounds seemed to come from all directions. Then Tom, one of our newest rangers, shouted, "Kit, look at this!" He was pointing his flashlight at a tree. Carved into the bark were symbols I'd never seen before, but they looked ancient. They were oozing that same red sap, and it felt warm to the touch, like blood. Our compasses stopped working too. The needles just spun in circles. The mist got thicker, and the trees. I swear the trees looked different every time I turned around. It was like the forest itself was changing. As darkness fell, we had no choice but to set up camp. None of us wanted to, but trying to find our way back in this mess would be suicide. We made a fire, the only normal thing about that night. But as we sat there, we could hear the forest whispering. I took first watch, sitting by the fire, holding my grandmother's pouch tight. The others tried to sleep, but I could tell from their tossing and turning that nobody really could. Not with those whispers in the dark. Not with the feeling that something was watching us from between the trees. Little did I know this was just our first night in what the forest had become, and what waited for us in the morning would make these strange events seem like nothing at all. I must have dozed off during my watch because I woke up to Tom shaking my shoulder. "Kit, wake up. Sarah's gone." My heart started racing. Sarah was our team's medic, and she'd been sleeping right next to me. Her sleeping bag was empty, but something was wrong. It wasn't unzipped. It was like she'd vanished right through it. As we looked around camp calling her name, I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The trees around our campsite weren't the same ones from last night. I know it sounds crazy, but I'd marked the trees with my ranger tape, orange strips that were now wrapped around trees that stood in completely different spots. "Everyone, stay calm," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "We need to." That's when we heard Sarah's voice through the radio. "Kit, can anyone hear me? I'm by the old oak tree near Loggers Point." The thing is, I knew every tree in this forest. There wasn't any oak tree near Loggers Point. Never had been. We followed her voice anyway. The mist was still there, thicker now, and that red sap seemed to be everywhere. As we walked, I noticed more footprints leading into trees, and the weird symbols were spreading like some kind of infection across the bark. Then Tom pointed up. "Look!" Above us, caught in the branches, was Sarah's radio. Just the radio, hanging there like someone had carefully placed it, and it was still playing her voice over and over, like a recording. "We need to get out of here," I said. But when we turned around, nothing looked familiar. The forest had changed again. Even the sun seemed wrong, like it was setting in the east instead of the west. That's when we found the old photos, scattered on the ground like someone had just dropped them. They were black and white, showing loggers from the 1890s standing in front of a massive pile of cut trees. But in the background of one photo, half hidden in the shadows, was something that made my blood freeze. A tall, dark figure that seemed to be made of twisted branches and roots. I picked up the photos with shaking hands, and that's when I heard it, the sound of trees creaking and moving, but not from the wind. No, this was something else. Something that shouldn't be possible. And then we heard the screams. The screams came from Tom's direction. I spun around just in time to see him backing away from something that shouldn't exist. A tree was moving. Not swaying in the wind, but actually moving its branches like arms, reaching for him. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Tom's jacket and pulling him back. We ran, the rest of our team right behind us. The ground beneath our feet felt wrong, like it was shifting. Tree roots burst from the soil, trying to trip us. We made it to a small clearing, all of us breathing hard. That's when I noticed we were one person short. "Where's Mike?" I asked, counting heads. Nobody had seen him fall behind. A low moan echoed through the trees. We all turned to look, and there was Mike, or what looked like Mike, standing at the edge of the clearing. But something was terribly wrong. His skin was like bark, and his fingers were long and twisted like branches. "That's not Mike," I whispered, backing away slowly. "Nobody move." The thing that looked like Mike tilted its head at an impossible angle and smiled, a smile that was too wide, showing what looked like wooden teeth. Then it stepped backward and simply melted into a tree trunk, like it had never been there at all. My grandmother's story started making sense now. She used to tell me about the forest walker, an ancient spirit that protected these woods. She said it could make the trees dance and could wear people's faces like masks. I always thought they were just stories to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. Kit, what's happening? Tom's voice was shaking. This can't be real. Before I could answer, we heard a helicopter overhead. The Forest Service must have sent search and rescue. But as the helicopter got closer, the mist grew thicker and the trees started to grow. Right before our eyes, they shot upward, their branches reaching for the helicopter like hungry fingers. No, 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 I whispered, watching helplessly as the helicopter's lights disappeared into the mass of twisted branches. Then came the crash, the sound of metal crushing against wood, and then silence. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with just a search and rescue mission anymore. We were fighting for our lives against something that had been waiting in these woods for a very long time, and it was angry. We need to get to the old burial ground, I said, remembering my grandmother's teachings. It's our only chance. What burial ground? Tom asked. The one the logging company found last week. My grandmother told me it's a sacred place. If there's any hope of stopping this thing, that's where we'll find it. But getting there meant going deeper into the forest, deeper into its trap. We had no choice but to move. The burial ground was about 2 miles away, but in this twisted forest it might as well have been 100. I took out my grandmother's medicine pouch and tied it around my neck. Inside was sage tobacco and a small iron knife, things she said would protect me from evil spirits. Stay close, I told Tom and the others. There were only 4 of us left now. Whatever happens, don't touch the red sap, and don't answer if you hear someone calling your name. We walked carefully, trying to avoid the roots that kept moving under our feet. The forest was playing tricks on us. Sometimes we'd see people walking between the trees, loggers in old-fashioned clothes, children playing or our missing friends, but they would vanish when we looked directly at them. The worst part was the trees. They were changing as we walked past them. Some had faces now, twisted, screaming faces pressed out from under the bark. Others had arms and legs trapped inside them, like people frozen mid-step. Kit, whispered Jenny, our youngest ranger. Look at this. She was pointing at an old tree stump. There was a book inside it, an old logger's journal from 1890. The pages were stained with that red sap, but I could still read some of it. The 15th of October, 1890, they shouldn't have cut down the sacred trees. The elders warned us. Now it's hunting us. It takes our shape, wears our faces. God help us all. That's when we heard it, the sound of wood cracking and splitting. Behind us, a massive pine tree was, opening up. Its trunk split down the middle like a door, and inside was darkness, pure, deep darkness, and something was coming out. Run, I screamed, but as we turned to flee, we saw more trees opening up all around us. The forest walker was done playing games. It was time for its final hunt. Jenny screamed. I turned just in time to see roots wrapping around her legs, pulling her toward one of the open trees. I grabbed her hand and pulled out my grandmother's iron knife. The roots hissed and smoked where the iron touched them, and Jenny broke free. But we weren't safe yet, not even close, because now we could see it clearly, the forest walker itself. It was tall as a tree, made of twisted branches and roots, with glowing red sap dripping from its body. And its face was a combination of all the people it had taken over the years. We were almost to the burial ground, but would we make it in time? We ran faster than we'd ever run before, branches whipping at our faces. The burial ground was just ahead. I could see the old stone markers through the trees. But the forest walker was right behind us, its footsteps shaking the ground like thunder. Suddenly, Tom tripped and fell. As I turned to help him up, I saw his eyes go wide with terror. The ground beneath him was turning black, and roots were wrapping around his legs. Kit! He screamed, reaching for my hand. I lunged forward with the iron knife, but before I could reach him, the earth swallowed him whole. Just gone. Jenny started crying, and even Steve, our toughest ranger, looked ready to break down. We're almost there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just a few more steps. We made it to the burial ground just as the moon broke through the clouds. The old stones formed a circle, and in the center was a fire pit that hadn't been used in decades. My hands shook as I reached into my grandmother's pouch for the sage and tobacco. What are you doing? Steve asked, watching the trees close in around us. What my grandmother taught me, I answered quickly, making a small fire. The forest walker is powerful, but it's not invincible. Fire and iron are its weaknesses, and this is sacred ground. The forest walker appeared at the edge of the stone circle. It was even more terrifying up close. In its twisted face, I could see Mike, Sarah, Tom, all our missing friends. Their faces were screaming silently, trapped in the wood. You want to know why it's so angry? I said to the others while feeding the fire. I found out from that old journal. In 1890, loggers cut down sacred trees here, trees that the Native Americans had protected for generations. They didn't just kill trees, they destroyed ancient burial markers and disturbed sacred ground. The forest walker was born from that violation. The creature roared, a sound like 100 trees falling at once. It reached for us with its branch-like arms, but couldn't cross the stone circle. The fire was growing stronger, and where its light touched the forest walker, its wooden flesh seemed to shrivel. But we weren't safe yet, because now it was showing us what it could really do. The forest walker raised its twisted arms, and all around us the trees began to move. They were closing in, trying to crush our sacred circle. Jenny screamed as a branch grabbed her jacket, but Steve pulled her back just in time. "Kit, what do we do?" Steve shouted over the sound of creaking wood. My hands trembled as I remembered my grandmother's last lesson. "We need to give it what it wants," I said, reaching into the medicine pouch one last time. I pulled out an old piece of paper, my grandmother's final gift. On it were words in Ojibwe, a prayer of peace for troubled spirits. "Both of you, hold hands and don't let go," I ordered, throwing more sage into the fire. The smoke grew thick, but this smoke was different. It was pure white and seemed to push back against the red mist. I started reading the prayer, my voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. The forest walker screamed again, but this time it sounded different, almost like it was in pain. The faces trapped in its wooden body began to shift and move. "Look!" Jenny pointed at the ground. The black soil was turning normal again, and the red sap was disappearing. But then something happened that none of us expected. The forest walker spoke. Its voice was like rustling leaves and cracking branches, but I could understand it. It showed us visions, the forest as it was before the logging, peaceful and sacred. Then the destruction, the disrespect, the pain. It wasn't just angry, it was hurt, wounded by what humans had done. I knew what I had to do next. I stepped forward, still inside the circle, and held out my grandmother's medicine pouch. "We understand now," I said softly, "and we're sorry. But taking more lives won't heal these wounds. Let them go, all of them. And we promise to protect this place, to keep it sacred as it should have been." The forest walker lowered its arms, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. Then the forest walker began to change. The faces trapped in its body started to fade away, and one by one, people began appearing on the ground around us. Mike, Sarah, Tom, and all the missing loggers. They were unconscious but alive, their chests rising and falling slowly. The creature's massive form started to shrink, the twisted branches untangling themselves. As it got smaller, the angry red glow of its sap turned to a soft, gentle green. Finally, it was just the size of a normal tree, but still alive, still watching. "Kit," Tom groaned, sitting up slowly. "What happened?" I remember the roots, and then darkness. Before I could answer, the ground started trembling again, but this time it was different. Small saplings began pushing up through the soil, not twisted or wrong, but healthy and strong. The forest walker was healing the land. I turned to where the creature stood, now just a young tree with a faint green glow. "We'll keep our promise," I said softly. "This place will be protected." As if in response, leaves rustled in a wind that wasn't there. The red mist completely vanished, and the forest, well, it felt like a forest again, normal. But different too, there was something sacred about it now that I could feel in my bones. We got everyone back to safety, though nobody quite remembered what had happened to them. The official report said they were all found in an unexplained group blackout, probably from some kind of gas leak. Nobody except Steve, Jenny, and me knew the truth. The Forest Service declared the area restricted, marking it as a protected Native American heritage site. I made sure the burial ground was properly preserved, and every full moon I go back there with sage and tobacco, keeping my promise. Sometimes when I'm patrolling that part of the forest, I see a tree with a gentle green glow, and I know the forest walker is still there, not as an angry spirit anymore, but as a guardian, a protector. The loggers never came back, and the forest grew stronger than ever. But if you go there at sunset and listen carefully, you might hear the trees whisper. They're telling an old story, a story about respect, about sacred lands, and about a forest that refused to be forgotten. It's been over 40 years since that October night, and I'm still the ranger here at Chippewa National Forest. My hair's gone grey now, but I haven't forgotten a single detail of what happened. How could I? Every now and then someone asks me about the restricted area and why they can't go there. I just tell them it's protected land and leave it at that. But I keep watching, making sure no one disturbs the peace we made that night. The younger rangers think I'm just a superstitious old lady when I tell them to always carry iron and sage in their packs. They laugh when I warn them about respecting the trees. That's okay. I used to be like them too before I learned the truth. Last week, a new logger company asked for permits to cut in the northern section. When I denied their request, they demanded to know why. I took them for a walk near the restricted area. Funny thing, their chainsaws stopped working as soon as we got close. They saw that gentle green glow between the trees, felt that ancient presence watching them, and suddenly they weren't so interested anymore. Tom, Jenny, and Steve still visit sometimes. We don't talk much about that night, but we share knowing looks when the wind blows just right and the trees sway in that special way. We're the guardians now, keeping the balance between our world and the forest's ancient spirits. My grandmother's medicine pouch hangs by my desk these days. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it whisper, reminding me of the promise we made. And you know what? That's just fine by me. Some promises are meant to last forever. After all, every forest has its secrets. But now you know one of them. Just remember, next time you're walking in the woods and feel like something's watching you, well, maybe something is. My name is Gabriel Rhodes, but everyone calls me Gabe. I've spent most of my life here on Mount Hood as a ranger, and let me tell you about something terrifying that happened back in December 1988, something that changed my life forever. I'm 41 now, and I've been working in these mountains for almost 20 years. Being from the Warm Springs tribe, I grew up listening to our elders' stories about the mountain spirits. Back then, I used to think they were just tales to keep kids from wandering too far. Boy, was I wrong. 3 years ago, I lost Sarah, my wife, somewhere on this mountain. She was an experienced climber just like me, but one day she just vanished. They never found her body. I blame myself. I was the mountain rescue team leader, but I couldn't even save my own wife. That guilt has eaten at me every single day since. You know how some people can feel when a storm's coming? Well, I've always had this special sense about weather changes. My grandmother used to say it was a gift from our ancestors. This sixth sense has saved many lives during rescue missions, but it also warned me about something unusual that was about to happen. It all started when we had the worst snowfall anyone had ever seen. The weather was acting strange, really strange. The temperature dropped lower than we'd ever recorded, and this weird fog kept appearing and disappearing around the 7,000-foot mark. But that was just the beginning of our nightmare. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I got the call that would start this whole nightmare. 6 climbers had gone missing near Devil's Peak. At first, I thought it was just another regular rescue mission. We get those all the time during winter, but something felt different this time. As I geared up at the ranger station, my hands were shaking. Not from the cold, but from that feeling in my gut, the same one I had the day Sarah disappeared. The weather reports were all over the place. Our instruments showed negative 80 DU-4F at the peak, which was impossible. I mean, it gets cold up there, but never that cold. I gathered my rescue team, 5 of our best people. While checking our equipment, Mike, my deputy, called me over to the window. "Gabe, you ever seen anything like that?" he asked, pointing at the mountain. There was this strange fog hanging around the middle of the peak, but it wasn't moving like normal fog should. It just stayed there, like it was watching us. We tried sending up our rescue helicopter first, but it couldn't get through the fog. The pilot said it was like hitting a wall of white cotton. Even stranger, when we tried radioing up to the missing climber's last known location, our messages came back to us backwards, like someone had recorded them and played them in reverse. Then we found the first clue, and that's when I knew we were dealing with something I'd never faced before. Near the base of Devil's Peak, we found these sculptures. They looked exactly like people, made of ice, frozen in mid-step. They were so detailed you could see the terrified expressions on their faces. The weird part, there was no ice anywhere else around them, just these perfectly formed ice statues standing in the snow. My grandmother's stories about the sky spirits kept playing in my head. She used to warn us about things that lived in the mist, things that weren't supposed to be disturbed. I'd always nodded politely at those stories, but standing there looking at those ice sculptures, every single one of those warnings suddenly felt very, very real. Little did I know this was just the beginning of our troubles. The real horror was still waiting for us up there in that impossible fog. We decided to climb up and search for the missing people. My team looked nervous, but we had a job to do. As we got higher up the mountain, the air got colder, not regular cold, but the kind that bites right through your warmest clothes. Around 6,000 feet up, our compasses started spinning like crazy. Our phones died even though they were fully charged. That's when we heard it. Voices in the fog, calling our names. Mike swore he heard his brother calling him, which was impossible because his brother lived in Florida. "Everyone stick together," I ordered, tightening my grip on the rope connecting us. The fog was getting thicker, and I could barely see 10 feet ahead. Then Jenny, one of our newest team members, screamed. "Look over there," she pointed with a shaking hand. Through the fog, we saw something that made my blood freeze. It was a person just standing there, completely still. As we got closer, my heart nearly stopped. It was another ice statue, but this one looked exactly like Sarah, my wife. It wasn't just a rough shape, it was perfect, down to the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. She was frozen mid-stride, her hand reaching out for something. But that wasn't even the scariest part. When we looked away and then back again, the statue had moved. Not much, just slightly, but enough for all of us to notice. "Gabe," Mike whispered, "remember those old stories your grandmother used to tell us about the frost wraith?" Before I could answer, we heard a sound like cracking ice, followed by a low moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The temperature dropped so fast our breath turned to ice crystals in front of our faces. Through the swirling fog, I saw something moving, something that looked like fog but moved with purpose, like it was alive. "Run!" I yelled, but as we turned to go back down, we realized we were surrounded by more ice statues. And in the fog beyond them, something was watching us, something that had been waiting for a very long time. We ran as fast as we could back to our base camp, but the fog followed us like it had a mind of its own. That's when Mike tripped and fell behind. I turned back to help him, but what I saw made me freeze in place. The fog was wrapping around him like fingers, and right before my eyes, frost started forming on his skin. "Help!" he screamed, but his voice got weaker as ice crystals spread across his face. The others wanted to go back for him, but I knew we'd all die if we did. "Keep moving," I ordered, my heart breaking as I heard Mike's last gasp. Back at base camp, we huddled in the main tent, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Jenny was shivering uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from fear. "What is that thing?" she asked through chattering teeth. I pulled out my grandmother's old journal that I always carried with me. She had written down all the tribal stories, including ones about the frost wraith. According to her writings, it was an ancient spirit that lived in the mountain mist, feeding on human warmth. The more people it took, the stronger it got. Suddenly, our radio crackled to life. Through the static, we heard voices, dozens of them all calling for help. I recognized some of them, the missing climbers, Mike and Sarah. They were all there, trapped somewhere in that thing. The temperature in the tent started dropping rapidly. Ice crystals formed on the canvas walls, and our breath came out in thick white clouds. Through the tent's window, we could see them, ice statues, dozens of them surrounding our camp, and they were all slowly turning their heads to look at us. "There's something in my grandmother's journal," I said, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. "A way to fight this thing. The frost wraith has one weakness, sacred fire from our tribal rituals." But as I read those words, the tent's entrance burst open, letting in a blast of freezing air and that living fog. We were out of time. The frost wraith had found us, and it was hungry. We grabbed our emergency packs and ran outside, but the ice statues were closing in. Jenny screamed as one of them grabbed her arm, its icy touch spreading frost across her jacket. I pulled her away just in time, but her sleeve was frozen solid and shattered like glass. "The cave," I shouted, pointing to an opening in the rocks nearby. "My ancestors used it for ceremonies." We sprinted toward it, the living fog right behind us. Inside the cave, ancient drawings covered the walls, pictures of our tribe's holy men fighting something that looked just like what was chasing us. I quickly pulled out the sacred herbs and fire-making tools from my pack, things I'd always carried to honor my grandmother but never thought I'd actually need. My hands were shaking as I tried to start the fire, while the others watched the cave entrance in horror. "It's coming, Gabe," Jenny cried. The fog was seeping into the cave, bringing with it those voices again. This time I heard Sarah clearly. "Gabe, please help me, I'm so cold." I tried to ignore the voice, focusing on the fire. Just as the first spark caught, something incredible happened. The fog touched the small flame and jerked back like it had been hurt. The voices turned into angry shrieks. "That's it," I said. The stories were true. We worked quickly, making the fire bigger with the special herbs my grandmother had taught me about. The cave filled with sweet-smelling smoke, pushing the fog back. But then we heard a sound that made our hearts stop, ice cracking and shifting. Through the cave entrance, we saw all the ice statues moving at once, like a frozen army. Behind them in the fog, something was taking shape, something huge. Look, Tom, our youngest team member, pointed at the cave walls. The ancient drawings were starting to glow with a faint blue light. And there, right in front of us, was a picture showing exactly what we needed to do next. The cave drawing showed a circle of fire surrounding a dark shape that looked like our fog creature. Next to it was a symbol I recognized. It meant winter solstices, which was today. This wasn't just luck. The frost wraith had been waiting for this exact day. "We need to make a fire circle," I explained, my voice shaking. "But not here. It has to be at the summit." Even as I said it, I knew how crazy it sounded. Going up instead of down, straight towards danger. Jenny looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "The summit. We'll freeze to death." "We'll die anyway if we don't try," I said, grabbing the remaining herbs and supplies. "This thing won't stop until it has everyone on the mountain." As we prepared to leave the cave, Tom spotted something in the corner. Old torches left by my ancestors. They were dry and still good. We lit them with our sacred fire, and suddenly we had weapons. The moment we stepped outside, the ice statues turned towards us. But when we held up the torches, they backed away. The fog swirled angrily but couldn't come close to our flames. We started climbing higher, using the torches to keep the frost wraith at bay. The wind got stronger, and the cold was worse than anything I'd ever felt. Then Jenny screamed. Her feet were starting to freeze to the ground. "Don't stop moving," I yelled, pulling her forward. "If you stop, it'll get you." Halfway up, we heard a sound like breaking glass. Tom had slipped on the ice and his torch went out. Before we could reach him, the fog surrounded him. In seconds, he became another ice statue, his face frozen in terror. "Keep climbing," I ordered, though my heart was breaking. We were down to just 3 of us now, and the summit was still so far away. Above us, the fog was gathering into something massive, and I could swear I saw red eyes glowing in its center. We finally reached the summit, but what we saw there made us stop in our tracks. Hundreds of ice statues stood in a huge circle, and in the middle was something that looked like a tornado made of fog. Inside it, I could see faces forming and disappearing, all the people it had taken over the years. "There," I pointed to a flat area. "We need to make the fire circle there." But just as we started moving, Jenny slipped on the ice. Her torch rolled away and went out. The fog moved faster than I could reach her. "No!" I screamed, but it was too late. Jenny turned to ice right in front of us, her hand still reaching out for help. Now it was just me and Dave, my last team member. We worked as fast as we could, using the remaining herbs to make a circle of small fires. The ancient drawings had shown 7 fires, and we had just enough supplies. As we lit the last one, the fog creature let out a horrible scream that shook the whole mountain. Then I saw her, Sarah, my wife, standing just outside our fire circle. She looked exactly like she did the day she disappeared, reaching out to me. "Gabe, please, help me come home," she whispered. "That's not Sarah." Dave grabbed my arm as I started to step forward. "It's trying to trick you." The fog creature was getting angry. It rose up higher and higher, forming into a giant shape with glowing red eyes. The wind howled around us, trying to blow out our fires. That's when I realized what the last part of the ritual needed, a sacrifice. Looking at Dave, I knew what I had to do. "When I run out there," I told him, "throw the last of the sacred herbs into the fires, all of them." "Gabe, no," Dave shouted, but I was already moving. I ran straight at the fog creature, holding my torch high. "You want me?" I shouted. "Come and get me." The thing rushed toward me, exactly like I hoped it would. Behind me, I heard Dave throwing the herbs into the fires. The creature wrapped around me, and the cold was worse than anything I'd ever felt. It was like being frozen from the inside out. Through the swirling fog, I saw all the faces of the people it had taken, including Sarah's, but this time I saw something else in her eyes, not fear, but strength. Just when I thought I couldn't take the cold anymore, the fires around us blazed up bright blue, reaching higher than trees. The fog creature screamed, but it couldn't let go of me. I had it trapped. The ancient ritual was working. "Gabe!" Dave yelled from behind the fires. "Hold on!" The creature started to shrink, pulling back into itself. As it did, I saw the ice statues beginning to crack. One by one, they shattered, releasing all the people trapped inside. They fell to the ground, weak but alive. Among them, I saw Mike, Jenny, Tom, and Sarah. But the fog creature wasn't done. As it got smaller, it pulled harder at me, trying to take me with it. The cold was so bad I couldn't feel anything anymore. My vision started going dark. Then I felt warm hands grabbing me, pulling me back. It was Sarah and the others, fighting to save me. With one final scream that shook the whole mountain, the fog creature collapsed into itself and vanished. I fell backward into Sarah's arms, shivering but alive. Around us, the rescued people were hugging each other, crying with joy. The nightmare was over. "How did you know what to do?" Dave asked me later, as rescue helicopters finally made their way to us. I pulled out my grandmother's old journal, now frozen and cracked. "Sometimes," I said, hugging Sarah close, "the old stories are more than just stories." The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews and news reporters. Nobody could explain what had really happened up there. The official story was that a rare weather phenomenon had trapped climbers on the mountain, but we all knew the truth. Most of the rescued people were okay, just very cold and confused. Some couldn't remember anything from their time in the ice. Others, like Sarah, remembered everything, being trapped in a cold, dark place, aware but unable to move. "It was like being in a frozen dream," Sarah told me as we sat in our warm living room a week later. "I could see everything happening but couldn't do anything about it, until you came." The mountain changed after that day. The Park Service closed off Devil's Peak, saying it was too dangerous for climbers. But I think they were scared of what might still be up there. The strange fog never completely went away. Sometimes people see it swirling around the summit, especially during winter. I still work as a ranger, but now I have a new job too. Every solstice, I go up the mountain with other tribe members to perform the ancient fire ceremony. We make sure the frost wraith stays trapped in its prison of sacred flames. Sometimes on really cold nights, I can hear it calling, trying to trick people into coming up the mountain. Sarah helps me now, teaching new rangers about the weather dangers on Devil's Peak. We keep the real story to ourselves, but we make sure everyone knows not to go near the summit when the fog rolls in. Last week, my grandmother's old journal finally dried out. On the last page, I found something I hadn't noticed before. In her shaky handwriting, it said, "The mountain keeps its secrets, but some secrets must be guarded." She knew. She'd always known, and now so do I.